Now we're good.
Hey, welcome to Reality Coaching for Writers. As you might notice, I do not have my normal co-host with me today. Eddie Jones is at the beach, but we have Elizabeth Kim here with us today. Welcome, Elizabeth.
How are you?
Good, good. I'm so happy to have you here. We've been wanting to get you on Reality Coaching for Writers, and today worked out to be the day, and I'm so happy about that.
Thank you.
So what's the temperature in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania today?
It is, well, okay, it says it's only 76, and I realize that's nothing for North Carolina, but we've been in the 50s forever, so we're all dying.
Well, actually, we're just 75 here today, but the humidity is 69%, so it's a little muggy, a little bit, but pretty nice. We have a gentle breeze blowing off the ocean, so we're enjoying it. But Elizabeth, I was excited because you're going to talk about the rule of 6.
Right.
And I'm going to be taking notes today too, metaphorically. I'm going to listen to this later and take notes, but I'm excited about this because it's a rule that not a lot of people are familiar with, and I think it's very helpful. Now, did you tell me it's for both fiction and nonfiction writers, both?
It is. It is. It's a little bit easier to understand for fiction writers because we're so used to talking about the plot arc.
Right.
And so a lot of what I'm going to say is really going to jive with that. But in actuality, it's about pacing. And it's about pacing for any type of writer. So,
okay.
And it really, it's actually very straightforward. It is the rule of 6. So like the number 6. And essentially all you do is you take the length of whatever it is you're writing and you split it down into 6 segments.
Okay.
Okay. And there are certain tasks that you want to be sure that you've completed within each segment and that you're not like staying there for too long. And again, this is something that fiction writers are used to hearing because, people will say it drags or the pacing's not right. We don't say that as often to nonfiction writers, but it's also true. How often do you pick up a nonfiction book and you get into it and then it like goes nowhere, or at least not fast enough, and then you don't keep reading?
Right, exactly.
Or you read the back of the book, it sounds like it's going to be amazing, but you start reading it and you just can't get into it. And this is why the rule of 6 is so important. So if we think of it in terms of these 6 segments, you can also split them down into halves or thirds, right? Just like any other type of fraction, pieces of pie,
right.
However you want to think about it. Okay. And so I'm going to look at the first third at the beginning. And then we'll look at that 6th that leads up to the half. And then we'll look at the last half together.
Okay.
Okay. And break it down.
Great. Yeah.
The first third is like your introduction. And if you're a fiction writer, that's going to be the exposition and conflict. Okay. Now, every fiction writer knows that you've got to have an essence of that conflict in that first paragraph, right? There's got to be a hint of it there. So it's not that you're waiting until the end of that first 6 to introduce the conflict, but at 1/6, it should be fully explained. We should know. So you've had hints of it, but it needs to be fully explained. But that part leading up to it, we've got to both understand the background of your story, but also how that applies to us. Like we have to love the character. We have to love the place where they are. Okay. And that all has to happen right away. Sometimes we forget that as writers because we've already fallen in love with our character. And, you know, we know that there's this thing that's going to happen later that's just going to make everyone's heart break. And like, you know, we're going to want to embrace them, but it hasn't happened yet for our reader. So that has to happen in that first sixth. And then in that second sixth, from the moment that you start to define what the conflict is, we know what it is. And then in that next sixth, which will make up that first third of your book, you need to explain why that's relevant. Like, what are the consequences of losing that? Right. And that makes it so much more important to us. It's now we're invested. And that must happen in the first third. Now, that's pretty easy for our fiction writers to understand, because we always talk about that, right? Conflict is so important. Character is so important. How does that relate to our nonfiction writers?
Yes.
Okay. You need to set up a compelling background in that first sixth. We need to know not only what other people have thought up until this point and why what you're saying is new. We also need to know how it applies to us. That needs to be very compelling. I need to be able to read that and say, oh, that's not only interesting, I have to know what comes next. Right. And then at 1/6, where we would normally get the conflict, the explanation of the conflict in a fiction book, we're getting the special assertion of the author. What is it that you bring to this discussion that is different than everybody else? And what does that mean for the topic as a whole? Right. Yes. And so then you're spending that next sixth developing that assertion of yours and what it means, so that by the time we get to the end, which is 1/3 of the way through your book, we should understand the consequences for not grasping that. Like, what happened? Like, how are we missing out if we don't know what you have to tell us? And what are the potential benefits of knowing it? Right? This should open up. Okay. And to both fiction writers and nonfiction writers, I would challenge you, go out and get some best-selling books in your genre. And if you're reading, I would get the Kindle app. At the bottom, it tells you the percentage that you are through the book. And you will notice that 1/6 part, that spelling out of the conflict or that introduction of the assertion, right? It happens right between 15 and 18%. Right. Wow. And you will suddenly notice that like the consequences of that conflict are made clear between 30 and 33%. That is 1/3 of the way through. And once you start to see just how regimented this is in the industry, you'll understand how it helps make your book saleable, number one, but also understandable to your reader. Yes. Because if you don't follow the conventions that we're used to, we don't like hear what you're saying. You know, I mean, it's kind of like you expect your kid to come down in his pajamas and ask for a glass of water. But if he comes down in his pajamas and asks you, explain to me the square root of 2, you're blown away. Like, you don't understand that, right? Because context is everything. So at the right time, it has to show up for us to understand.
Oh, that's so good. I just think of, you just have echoed so many of the things that we echo all the time, is pacing, first of all. Right. Definitely keep the attention of your reader. But the other thing is, first of all, your reader is selfish. If they don't get something pretty quick, they will just shut the book down, fiction or nonfiction. And we've talked many times how many nonfiction books are never completed because so many people start, they get something and they run with that and they just don't complete them. And I was surprised at that, Elizabeth, because I went to my bookcase. I thought, that's not true. And I went to my bookcase and I had bookmarks in so many nonfiction books that I had never finished. I was shocked. Yes. I was pretty shocked about that. And so I love the cheat code that you just gave us. That to use the Kindle and see the percentage right there. That's awesome.
Well,
So,
yes. And you can
okay,
also
so-
use it. Oh, you're very welcome. I mean, because the thing is, everybody's doing their best, right? And as a long time tutor, teacher of writing, you know, I've done editing, all this different kind of thing. Like, I want this to go somewhere. I don't want it to be stalled. And you don't want it to be stalled, right? So how do we get it through? So, and one of the other important things, I'm talking about this as if it's the whole book. But as many of your readers will know, every scene is a short story. Every chapter is a short, you know, piece. And this rule applies to any small piece. So within your story, every chapter or your nonfiction, every argument you make, every subheading, every subsection follows again this rule of 6. And so you just apply the same rule, right? So if you know that, you know, your publisher, or even just in your own mind, you want to write this book and you want it to be 70,000 words, right? Although it would be easier for us, just for the sake of argument, I'm going to go to 60,000 because it divides better.
Yeah.
So let's say, you know, you've got 60,000 words. All right. And that means you've got 6 subsections of 10,000 words. And then I'm in my first, and let's say I want every chapter to be kind of 3 ideas, right? Because then the rule of 3, we get the 3 ideas, right? And so then I break that down and I know, okay, so then every chapter, 10,000 words. And I want my first idea in the first 33,000 or 3,300, 3,300, and then the next one in 3,300 and the final one in 3,300, right?
Okay.
And I can break those down and say, okay, 3,300 divided by 6 is about 615. Okay, so I'm 615 words through. Have I spelled out what the purpose of this first idea is? And can I spend the next 615 words making sure you've gotten it? Like, to have an actual measurable way to say, am I meeting my goals? It's just so helpful. I mean, because it's like every diet that all of us have ever tried. And I mean, I'm sure if you could see even my face, you know, I've worked on diets, right? But if I don't have something to count, it's just amorphous, right? I mean,
measurable goals are the ones we actually reach.
That's right. They're the things that we can do, knowing what to do. So you're going to use the same idea of 6 to pace you all throughout your manuscript. So we've done the first. Good. I'm so glad that it's catching. So we've done the first third, right? And with 1/6 more, the first third comes to a half. And that 6 is the rising action to the turning point. Okay. And so in fiction, that's really well documented, right? You've got the rising action to the turning point, and then the action really ramps up right until that denouement, right? And then we've got, you know, this kind of quicker ending. For nonfiction, this is where you take the consequences of what you have to offer and you take them to the point, more like what Malcolm Gladwell would call the tipping point. So I'm taking you to the point where now we're headed in the right direction and we can really gain momentum. Like we've reached the top of the roller coaster and we're going to start really going. The excitement is going to start flowing. Okay. And so you want to be sure that whatever your ending, right? Like you've always got your ending in sight, kind of like heaven is our goal, you know, we see it at the finish line, right? Whatever your ending is, at the halfway point, your reader can see the finish line. They can't get there yet, but they can see that it's coming, right? And that can be, it doesn't have to be, you know, directly spelled out. Like in fiction, we don't want to do that. We want it to, but there's got to be that hint. They've got to be able to come back and say, oh, now I see that it was there all the time. right? So that has to happen at your 50% point.
Well, I have a question too.
Yeah.
So in fiction, I would think that is the place where the reader's invested in cheering the character on, you know, cheering
Yes.
the character on.
Well, and it's the, go ahead. What were you going to say? I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, you know, because you've set up the conflict, we know what's at risk for the character. And now it's the unpacking of that, and it's the action that is going to lead to the conclusion. And so as a reader, I'm like, come on, you could do it. Come on.
Yes.
Oh no, you know, and they hit different obstacles or whatever. But in nonfiction, would it be action steps for the person to participate now? Would it be?
Again, I think it's kind of like the turning point. So
Okay.
I'm going to go back to the fiction for a second, because I think that sometimes when it comes to pacing nonfiction, it's easier to go from fiction to nonfiction, you know?
Yeah.
So you called it the part where you root for the character. It's where I would also call it the first climax. So the first real test of the character's ability and their first win, right?
Okay.
Kind of their first overcoming. And so I think that kind of transfers to the nonfiction. So before that, we had like the consequences of that, you know, of whatever it is you're putting forward, the consequences of your assertion. That halfway point should be the first time it's really tested and we've really won something. We have gained ground. It's, you know, in the war, it's the victory of the first battle. Does that kind of?
Yes. So can you think of an example, like say we're trying to help somebody with anxiety, and so you've mapped out or pick something, Elizabeth, but you've delivered your premise, and you're showing a fresh perspective on it, bringing your fresh perspective. So here we are with something we encounter on a daily basis, and now we're being offered a new way of dealing with it and a new way of getting victory, maybe in that situation, or learning a better skill set to handle it.
Yes. Okay. So let's say we're doing anxiety, and I'm going to narrow it because anxiety is such a huge idea. So let's say we're doing how to treat anxiety through music. Okay.
Through what?
Through music, using music to help treat your anxiety.
Right.
Okay. So at 1/6, I would say, you know, even though we don't traditionally use music, right, there's actually a great deal of evidence that music helps with anxiety all the way back to the 16 and 1700s, like well documented, right? And then I would start to talk about what the consequences of that was, and you know, how it worked together. And I would probably talk about the ways that music was incorporated into the military, right? Because it calms the troops, right? And it set a whole bunch of other,
awesome. Yeah.
It bound them together. There's bunches of things that it did. It also marked time and told them when they had to show up places, right? But it did a bunch of other things as well. And so I would lead up to maybe 1/3 of the way through with that. And then kind of like you're saying that you've got the first actionable step, that actually starts 1/3 of the way through, like that next bit, that 3rd, 6th. But at that final spot, like when I end that, when I'm at halfway through, I should have imparted to my reader something that they can do right now that they should find a win. And I should have given them a full example of that. So I might talk about how corporate singing is known to regulate people together. And I might use the example of Desmond Tutu with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and the way that when they were in these heated moments, he would stop everyone and they would sing together, and it would bring the anxiety of the whole group down. You know, And so that should, it should feel like this big moment that opens doors, right? And these aren't necessarily just my ideas. Anybody who's interested, Bessel van der Kolk is the guy that actually wrote about that, kind of music and anxiety and PTSD. But that's how I would put it in a longer work. And then I would continue on with that, which I mean, Bessel didn't do. But I would start talking about, well, before I get into the exact bits, now what we're doing is we're leading them up to like this huge climax, right? So this 4th, 6th, from 1/2 to 2/3, we're taking something and we're upping the ante. Okay. So, and we're used to that in fiction, because what you're going to do is you're going to lead to your biggest climax, then you're going to sustain that climax for 1/3, and then you're going to resolve it in the final 6th. Right. But in nonfiction, what that looks like is really leading us up to one of our biggest tests to date. Okay. Like something huge that we have not completely understood. Okay. So I might talk about particularly like music and movement and the way that has worked, like kind of the research maybe with autism and selective mutism and things like that, which are not necessarily exactly anxiety, but there are a lot of people who feel they're anxiety related. And so I might do the research part of that. And then that takes me to 2/3 of the way through. So we've done 4 different 6ths. We're at 2/3 of the way through. And then this next 6th, I want to give, even though this is a nonfiction book, I want to give a very emotional, important example. And I would probably use like my own kids who've been dealing with autism and wraparound and selective mutism, and explain how, through music, we were able to get the little one to talk, what it was like before then and what it's like now and where he's gone with it, and how with music, the big one was able to understand feelings and learn to empathize with others, and, is going into psychology with this new kind of approach, right? It takes the ante out of the general and makes it very, very specific. This is the moment where we all cry, right? Like this is the moment you're like, right? It is that one specific example. Now, to nonfiction writers, I want to say, don't save it only for there. You should be having a little one of these in any of your chapters, right? There's always this moment, right? But it's going to be sustained here. And the fiction writers should understand that too, that you've got that climax. I mean, we've all read a book where we've been cheated out of a climax. This big thing is coming and you get there and what a letdown, right? Yeah. You have spent, right, essentially 1/3 of the book from the end of that, from the end of your consequence and conflict at 1/3 of the way through to that tipping point. And then you've got this, speeding up of the action, speeding up of the emotion, moving us now to this moment of secondary climax. You have to make that climax hang in there for a full 6. You cannot stop. You cannot start the resolution for that full 6. Wow. It's kind of like Jesus could not skip the time on the cross, and he did not immediately, hit the wooden bench and sit up done. We had 3 days. You have to spend the whole 3 days. If you cheat that, the book falls flat. And so that's
you're just giving definition to as a reader what I've experienced.
Yes, exactly. Well, but it's hard as a writer because the experience is so different. The experience of writing is not the same as the experience of reading. And so because you can't ever go back and unknow what you know and read it as if you're just reading it. It's very, very helpful to have some objective standards. And it also helps you give something to your alpha readers and your beta readers that's closer to a final. It's something that will help them better identify. Because if you can take care of the big things first, then you can really do some very meaningful changes with their feedback afterward.
Right. Right.
So, and then
Yeah,
that
that's good.
that final six is technically a resolution, but you know, that can look a whole bunch of different ways, because sometimes your writing is part of a trilogy. So it's not really a full resolution. It's an introduction to a new conflict. So we're tying up some things, starting something else. For a lot of nonfiction writers, we're writing about something that is not entirely solved. So this is where we talk, you know, in depth about what are the consequences of what we've done? How do we use them? How do you put it into practice in your life? Like, you should have been getting that all along, but this is where you really nail it home, right? Good. And where can you go to from here? And how do you contact me or a group? Or this is the place to say, how does life go on?
Okay, good. Yeah. I like that. That's so good, Elizabeth. Yeah, so good. I think you ought to write that music book or at least several articles or a blog series, something, because it's so fascinating. I mean, I think that shows why when we go into church, why there's worship first, because and you know, a lot of people say, why does worship have to go so long? But I think it takes a while for us together corporately, to lay aside the cares of the world. You know, we come in with all that, and worship helps us lay that down, and then be able to receive the word God has for us that day. So I always knew it served a purpose, but now I understand a little further just how God designed us. You know,
well, you know, it's so funny that you say that, because you're responding to like the content of what I said. But as I hear you, like, the editor in me is like, oh yes, you can't skip one of those parts. You have to devote the full time that is required, you know, and it makes sense to me. And so I think anytime we hear somebody talking within their expertise, and especially again when it's like this measurable thing, when you can go in and you experience the worship, or when I go through and I say, okay, I have to stay this many words in this idea, you know, and if I can't stay this many words in this idea, maybe that idea isn't big enough. Maybe I need to pull something there. It leads me to, again, a new understanding. It deepens what I have to offer.
Right. Yes. Yes. Oh, that's good. I know our time's about up, but I was thinking about we might have to have you come back again. I can't wait, because I know Eddie's going to have some questions for you too, or some comments, but we'll get that another time. But I just, I'm thinking about several things that clients I'm working with right now in relation to what you were saying. And even in one book that's a devotion, I can see, in fact, you and I were talking about that, about it is a sixth, it's applying to the format, applies to that sixth rule, the rule of sixes. So, and I'm glad that that is the rule that I, without knowing I was applying it, So,
well, you know, it's so funny. I mean, I don't know that it needs to be spelled out. I think it helps. It's one reason why teaching helps me do editing and other things. But I when I teach, I often teach reading comprehension, and we go all the way back. And I tell you, I can find the rule of 6 back in epic poetry. I mean, it's there. It's from long ago. And so we naturally follow it. And it's kind of like, the way God speaks to us, God doesn't speak to us in foreign languages. He speaks to us in our own language. I mean, that was kind of the lesson of Pentecost. And that was just this last weekend, that we celebrate this, that God speaks to us as we can hear. And so being able to understand, okay, this is the convention. This is the way people are used to receiving. Can I put this new message in a way that they can take it, that they can receive it, and I think that that's what makes it so powerful.
Yes. And that's what we want. We want whatever we have to offer to be able to be received. And we want, when they close the book, to say, wow, that was a good story, and have it impact them. But if it's a nonfiction, for the promise that we made to them, we want to fulfill that promise.
Yes.
Elizabeth, I'm doing this backwards, but I just want to share a little bit. I want you to tell us all the things you've done, but I met Elizabeth when she took my place at Heartline Literary Agency when I left Pittsburgh and I moved to Asheville. And Elizabeth was in the Heartline Literary Agency office for how many years? 6 years. That's how long I was there. It's the rule of 6.
It is. Yes, it is.
But Elizabeth, also just share a little bit of all the things, all the hats you've worn.
Oh, well, there are lots. But you know what? How do you just put it into words? I just want to say that the Lord is leading me through the wilderness. And I think that all of us wilderness wanderers will understand that.
Yes.
And I have always known that I wanted to deal with English and writing since I was very young. I mean, I was writing books, with my crayons before kindergarten. And then when I was 12, I told my mom I wanted to be an author, and she said, over my dead body. And that was like the beginning of a new season. But when I graduated college, I looked at the people that I had worked with, and I noticed that the ones I respected most had very broad backgrounds. They had experienced many things. So I left college saying, I want to do all things English, just all things English. And so I've been a technical writer. I actually started tutoring when I was 16, and I've always had at least one student. So there's been teaching. I've written some on my own. I've edited other people's work. I've done proofreading. I've done self-publishing, formatting for others. I've done a whole bunch of kind of contract work, curriculum writing. For a while I blogged, just a bunch of many different things. Life story writer, life story teacher, writing teacher. Yeah. And again,
and you're
technical
also
writer.
the mother of 2 incredibly gifted boys.
Thanks
and
be to God.
Music is a big thing in your home for yourself as well.
Yes, for both of them. And art, you can kind of see that behind me. Music and art. We like science. Yeah. I mean, God has just given us a great world to explore.
Yes, he really has. He really has. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with us today. And we'll schedule you back. I know we were talking about some grammar things. And
okay, yeah.
Writers always need help with our grammar, especially
we do.
Even editors need help with our grammar. And,
yes.
But we'll talk again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Have a great day.
You too.